Hello guys, Shadowfire204 here with my first game review. And the game I am reviewing today is Red Dead Redemption 2, a game that I have to say was my most anticipated game of the year. Before we get started, spoilers follow as I will be discussing the story. So in this review, I will be covering the story, combat and hunting, side missions, honor, music, and some problems I had with the game. So to start, I will begin with the story. In Red Dead Redemption 2, there are 6 chapters along with a 2-part epilogue. Chapter 1, Coulter, is a great cinematic, intense start to the game. But after the first mission, it becomes very slow-paced and restrictive due to this chapter setting up some things and basically being the tutorial to the game. Chapter 2, Horseshoe Overlook, is where things open up more and the game becomes entirely available to you, besides, well, Blackwater. You can still go to Blackwater, but you're wanted dead or alive, and it's pretty much impossible to do anything while in that part of the map. So this chapter sets up Agent Milton, along with letting you meet more of the gang and getting to know them. Things are still a bit slower paced in this chapter, but it's one of the better parts of the game. Chapter 3, Clemens Point, is where I first kind of started having issues with the game. Although it's not really the fault of the game, it's, I guess, more my taste. I don't really much care for the environment of the South and the bayou and swamp type stuff. I don't know, maybe Mafia 3 just kind of left a pretty bad taste in my mouth 2 or 3 years ago when that came out. So in this chapter, there's a feud between 2 families, the Braithwaites and the Greys. Overall, I didn't really think it was very good. They even have a literal inbred Romeo and Juliet subplot for 2 or 3 missions that doesn't go anywhere unless you do a side mission that shows up way later in the game in like chapter 6. So by the end, when they all turn against you, the Braithwaites and the Greys, I already saw it coming. Although I didn't know how it was going to happen the way it did. The end of this chapter does have to be one of the best parts of the entire game. Some things happen to Arthur, and one of the characters that I at least became attached to is just suddenly killed off. The rest of the chapter is extremely dark, and I love it. But chapter 4, Saint Denis, rolls around. This chapter introduces 2 of the shortest-lived antagonists in the entire game, Angelo Bronte and General Fusar. Or at least I think he's a general if I remember correctly. This chapter is very short and not very fun overall, again, until the end. Dutch begins to show signs that he might be a little bit crazy, and a big heist goes majorly wrong for the gang, getting 2 more members of the gang unceremoniously killed, and John arrested, and the gang split up. But again, this leads into another chapter I highly dislike, which is Chapter 5, Guarma. Arthur, Dutch, Bill, Javier, and Micah get involved in a shipwreck and stranded on an island, the island of Guarma, just outside of Cuba. They get stuck in the middle of this war between Fusar and the rebels, who you end up siding with. This chapter, it's very linear and just not fun overall, at least it wasn't for me. You've got your typical rebel jungle warfare shit. You kill Fusar in a quote-unquote boss battle after only seeing him in 3 30-second cutscenes prior and go home. I really don't see the purpose in this chapter beyond showing how Dutch starts to go crazy. I really don't. It just seems extremely out of place to the rest of the game. Chapter 6, Beaver Hollow, is when the game seems to get better. Micah has now become Dutch's voice of reason, making things go terribly wrong for the gang, making everyone question where their loyalties lie. In this chapter, Dutch manipulates a Native American by the name of Eagle Flies into rebelling for his own personal gain. while Arthur finds out he's sick with tuberculosis and he's running low on time. And he sides with Eaglefly's father, Rain's Fall, behind Dutch's back. Also in this chapter, a train heist eventually goes wrong, and this is when John is shot and seemingly killed. Sadie and Arthur go rescue Abigail from Agent Milton, who they just found out kidnapped her. And when they go to kill him, they find out Micah was ratting the gang out for a decent amount of time, and is why so many things have gone wrong in the past. This leads to Arthur confronting Dutch and Micah, John reappearing and saying how Dutch left them for dead, and the remaining members of the gang who haven't run off choose their sides, leaving Arthur and John outnumbered. In the final mission of this chapter, you are given the option of going back for Dutch's hidden stash of money, or making one last stand to help John escape and hopefully live a better life. The epilogue, both parts 1 and 2, Pronghorn Ranch and Beecher's Hope, see John trying to do just that several years later in 1907. John finds out Charles is alive after bumping into Uncle, and the three of them, begin building the Marston home at Beecher's Hope. Sadie returns as well as a bounty hunter and pretty much lets you tag along. This chapter also allows you to explore the entirety of New Austin from Red Dead Redemption 1 without a Dead or Alive, wanted level. Eventually, after John tries to settle down, Sadie finds out where Micah is, and the two of them plus Charles travel up to the mountains and try to kill him, avenge Arthur, and finally settle down to live a normal life. So, moving on to combat and hunting. So basically, Red Dead Redemption 2 has the typical Red Dead Redemption modern GTA combat, control-wise. There's a slight variation compared to previous titles in both respects. Shooting is a bit more difficult as all guns sway, like there's a constant gust of wind blowing into your hand at all times. Basically, it's a lot more difficult to aim, but by default there is an auto-aim feature, and all you have to do is just spam the aim button and then move the analog stick up a little bit and try to aim for the head, and it makes it a lot easier. So, enemy types, they don't really vary beyond the ones with guns and the one-shot melee enemies who are normally fast. Every time you face those, Charles is with you, and for some reason he just doesn't help with those specific enemies. He just watches them as they're charging at you with machetes and lets them kill you. Most enemy variation is the type of gang or law enforcement. There's 6 gangs in the game, and just different types of law enforcement depending on the region. Hunting, it becomes a bit irritating with the realism factor of the game. It's a lot harder to track, and it's nearly impossible to get a perfect kill and pristine pelts, especially with weather and going through rivers, and the fact that some pelts of some animals are already poor to begin with, and just how much they move. It's sometimes you'll get a headshot, and then with bison or buffalo or whatever, there's a lot of times where I'll try to shoot it in the head, and I'm using Deadeye, and I have marked the head, and it just swings its head back, and the rest of my bullets just go into its side, and then it dies, and then I have a poor pelt. Some of it's probably just my fault, but I don't really care for hunting myself. It's just not very good. It's not bad. It could be better. So moving on to side missions and honor. Side missions are your typical side missions pretty much, except for there's not as many fetch quests. They're not exclusively fetch quests like they are in the last game pretty much. Honor is kind of irritating. in some respects, it's a more personal thing. Bandanas only slightly help witnesses from identifying you, and no longer leaves honor unaffected. Honor takes a really long time to go up in some cases, but doing something very minor that's like wrong can bring it down in large chunks. Like, it took me forever to get it in the white, and then I did one thing wrong and it was basically down in the middle all over again. So moving on to music, I believe it's at least one of the same composers from Red Dead Redemption 1. The scores are just amazing, just like in Red Dead 1. There's some newer versions of the first game scores that return in the epilogue, and just in New Austin in general. It seems like when playing the epilogue and just exploring, you can hear it, like the score playing from the first game, a lot more than you would in the newer map. So from there, moving on to story issues and continuity errors. These aren't all very major, but I'll get into that in a second. So a few things just really don't add up with what people said in the original game. So in this game, John was involved in the Blackwater Massacre, but he didn't get shot and left for dead until several months later, although he did get shot during that time. But in the original game, he says he was involved in the Blackwater Massacre, and that's when he got left for dead and shot and all that. And if you go back to the original map, this is the minor one I was talking about, which is just one of the examples I have, which is if you go to McFarlane's ranch during the epilogue, which takes place only 4 years prior to the first game. Bonnie said in the first game that her father built that barn when she was a little girl, yet it's nowhere to be seen, only 4 years prior. But like I said, that's just one example, and that's just a minor gripe. There's just continuity errors throughout the story and just the environment. It seems I might have some of it wrong, but I know that one for a fact isn't wrong. She said when she was a little girl, and it's not there. So anyways, moving on to just general problems I had. There's like more dialogue than needed during rides, often being cut off by reaching at your destination, or characters needing to stop to do things in one or two cases. Certain character AI seems to be broken at times, especially Charles for some reason. One mission, riding somewhere where you're riding somewhere and you're supposed to lead the rest of the group to your destination, and for whatever reason, they will not follow you unless you are at a trot, and the conversation will just constantly cut off. You cannot listen to the conversation unless you're going at a trot. Meanwhile, there's someone on the back of your horse who is slowly bleeding out and getting ready to die, and that was the whole point of getting to your destination, was to potentially save him. And the rest of the characters are like, wait up, Arthur, stop what you're doing and wait up for us so we can have a conversation. And meanwhile, this guy's on your back, on the back of your horse, bleeding out and dying. And stuff like that. Not that exactly. That happened in one mission, but I had other problems similar to that throughout the game. So moving on to horse controls, they don't seem to respond at times. One example is trying to avoid trees and rocks, only for it to ram straight into them and fling me off, or jump off cliffs or drops when I'm trying not to. That happens so much. Like, I'll be holding the stick left or right, trying to move out of the way, only for it to just go straight ahead into the rock and throw me off. That happens so many times through my playthrough. It's ridiculous. It was extremely annoying. So anyways, we're going to be reaching the verdict here. Overall, as much as I'd like to give it a 10 out of 10, for me, it has to be an 8. The game doesn't reinvent the wheel, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but problems with combat, hunting, horseback riding, and honor, and AI, I can't give it that high of a score. The story is great, but only if you're the type of person who has time for slower paced, long horseback rides and cinematic cutscenes. Otherwise, this game won't be anywhere near as fun or great in general for you. Arthur Morgan is a great character who at first might not seem like much, but through side missions and progression of the story, has a lot more to him than you might think. Overall, despite all the negatives, I highly enjoyed this game and would highly recommend it to anyone who has an interest in playing it. So, this is my first review. Remember, these are my opinions and my experiences with the game. You might feel differently, but for me, the game is an 8 out of 10. Maybe with some patches, it might come up to a 9, but for now, it's at an 8. So, anyways, with all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want to. Leave a like if you did enjoy, and I'll see you guys in the next video.